Chapter 22 Trail. Anthea finished scolding Antonio, but he looked completely speechless. Almost a minute went by with Anthea staring at Antonio with fire in her eyes while not a word was said. Elle thought she got all of her anger out when she lectured him, but she looked like she could go for another 10 minutes.
Well, you can't even say sorry?
Anthea demanded. Antonio jolted straight up and said,
I'm sorry.
Closing their eyes as if they were praying that the simple apology would cool Anthea down. Antonio was the youngest cousin Anthea had. Sometimes she felt her younger siblings and relatives were like her children and felt greatly accountable for them, especially if something bad happened. As Aunt Witch's #1 familiar, she felt responsible for pitching in with the care of the colony. The loss of Antonio really worried her. She always pretended to recover from such a loss on the outside, but the inside she was deeply worried and hurt from the loss of Antonio. And here he comes, walking back like it was nothing. But she was overjoyed with his return. She almost couldn't believe he was still alive after all of this time. She smiled and patted him on the head.
Okay, I'll forgive you, this time,
she said, winking.
By the way, are you headed home?
Antonio looked up at her and nodded.
That's great! I was just trying to find which direction to head. Lead the way.
She started walking off and remembered Elle. She was so caught up in her reunion with Antonio that she forgot her main objective at the moment, getting Elle to Aunt Witch and finding their way home. She turned to Elle.
Antonio, this is Elle. Elle, Antonio.
Which only triggered another memory. Why was Antonio attacking Elle to begin with?
Antonio, why were you attacking Elle to begin with?
She demanded. Antonio stuttered.
I was shocked to see a human in the woods.
Anthea nodded. It wasn't common to see a human around here, so she could understand why he jumped to defending himself. She explained the situation beginning all the way back to how she stumbled about Elle and found him washed up in the river in the cave deep in the woods. Antonio listened in awe. You could almost see stars in his eyes. Anthea brought him back to reality by patting him on the head. She wanted to hear his story, but decided it would be best to listen to it on the way to Aunt Witch's place. They climbed up onto Elle's shoulders and they headed off after Antonio told them the way to the trail that led straight there. Antonio's story went a little something like this. He headed off on his test to graduate as an assistant to Aunt Witch. Not every aunt in the colony helped Aunt Witch with her studies. A lot of them helped out in other ways, or lived normal lives as ants in the woods. Antonio always looked up to Anthea ever since they were a small grub. He was practically her shadow for as long as he could remember, trying to soak up every little bit of knowledge and adventure that he could from her. When he came of age, it was time for him to gather a few key ingredients and mix up a rare and powerful potion for Aunt Witch, proving he had what it took to become an assistant. He had traveled through the woods, finding a few of the ingredients on his way, but there was one he was having trouble finding: the flesh of a rare and poisonous snake. Venomous snakes were a dime a dozen. It was the poisonous kinds that Aunt Witch found particularly interesting for the ingredients in her potions. Antonio was traveling around the hills beyond the woods when he caught the sight and smell of a festival that was being held by the local town. He couldn't resist checking it out. He was sure there would be rare and delectable foods for him to try that he couldn't find in the woods. He headed down the hills and made his way to a picnic where a spread of the most delicious foods were found. Just as Antonio was about to chow down, something started to attack him. He was able to escape, but just barely. His left antenna had been broken, and he had to get away to attend the wound. He decided food wasn't worth the risk of his life and headed back to the woods, but not before he got lost, which is what made him take so long to make it back to Aunt Witch's. Anthea shook her head. Food is an ant's #1 weakness. If he couldn't control it, he wouldn't be able to become one of Aunt Witch's assistants. They continued down the trail, exchanging stories of their adventures. At this rate, they would arrive at Aunt Witch's in no time.